Welcome back. Welcome back to the panel debate. And of course, we in the panel has this morning's keynote presenters. And what will be possible here is also to ask questions to the panel as part of this panel debate. Because we have a microphone, a running microphone, I'm just looking for it, but we have one at least. If you have already thought about questions, please raise your hand, and then we'll get you a microphone so that you can ask questions. Let's start out. I'll ask you a question to start out with. Is that I found it quite interesting this morning, also in a sense that there seems to be a consensus relating to that the play. As Andreas told us with his last slide, let the process play it works. I mean, also Ditte, Winther-Lindqvist, you also said that the play has its relative autonomy, also not imposing rules of the game, but creating its own rules. But one of the things that is actually, at least for me, a question is, you do not mention the grown-ups. How is it for them to become a legitimate member of the children's playfulness, or are they just out?
Generally in childcare, and also actually, in fact, at home with the parents, that adults generally have a place in children's play. But it's quite delicate how that is played out. They can also ruin children's play if they do it in wrong ways. So I think my take would be, again, concretely with the soccer playing boys that I presented before. They do not. I mean, they do not sort of transgress gender boundaries by themselves, right? So if these girls should become visible as actual players in the eyes of the boys, an adult intervention would be quite, would be quite necessary in order, and that is actually also happening because sometimes the adults played in this play group. And what then happened was that the rules were much more rigid, applying for all, as opposed to when they played by themselves. And also that they had to accept the female players, for instance. So you can assert from an adult perspective another sort of norm and teach them what you find is the better norm. And also I find, but that's not in this particular group, but more in pretend play, that adults are much more skilled in inspiring for new content, for new material, for expanding the sphere of imagination. As Bo also said, it is quite narrow what children play. Okay. So if an adult is skillful in participating without taking over completely, an adult can inspire to different worlds and opening.
But can you tell us what is it to be skillful as an adult?
Yes,
an inspiring partner for the children?
Well, but it's quite untangible because it's about I think social and pedagogical tact, and you can't really. It's like playing music in that particular way, which is nice. It's more like a dance or something. You can say something, but it's hard to formulate an exact recipe for how to do that. Okay,
but to be good at dancing as a metaphor is...
You have to follow the rhythm, and you have to be responsive to the other partner's way of doing it. And what we find is that there are Again, I like the metaphor of scalar things, as you said, as I also with them. And from one end of the spectrum, you have very interventionist programs where adults sort of instruct children to play in particular ways. And at the other end of that scale, you'll have very withdrawn adults who only sort of interfere if there's an accident, kind of. And somewhere in between, and somewhere and I think also it depends on the children. I mean, some children really need much more guidance in their play than other children. So, and it's making that call, which is really difficult, and also knowing when is it my time to step back, when is it my time to intervene and inspire, and also inspire to think. You know, these little questions that make the transformative move in the interaction.
Okay.
So that would be my very long answer.
Okay. Okay. Before going to the first question from the audience, Paul, you at the end of your presentation made a reflection about encroachment on children's play in US. But could you all, and you said there was a movement on the one hand that actually encroached because they didn't see play as so meaningful or meaningful in terms of having learning consequences and so forth. But on the other hand, you also had another movement that tries to defend children's play. But in a sense, what are your position in relation to, I mean, of course it's a policy question, but on the other hand, also to grown-ups in a way interfering or intervening in children's play for better or worse?
I guess I should switch this on. I must admit I'm slightly nervous about this debate that's going on. Partly because, in some sense, it seems to me misplaced. In other words, it would be foolish, even if the results of these interventions are less dramatic than some investigators hope, that wouldn't be grounds for restricting children's play. I mean, the same thing is happening with, say, music education. So there's withdrawal of funding for music education within the schools. And so some researchers try to show that music not only enables you to play music, but it also has other cognitive benefits. But I sort of feel that when we get into this argument, we lose sight of the intrinsic value of certain just ordinary human activities. And as I was trying to say at the beginning, you know, pretend play, acts of the imagination, collaborative acts of the imagination are just part of being a human being. So I don't think we need research to defend this.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, just to follow up on Paul's insertion there. So the debate very often goes to the idea that, you know, that then play should be for children and should be valued for children, and we need to protect it there. But it seems to me that the play is really a general human activity, and it is not for children alone. We see it often in children, but those aspects of play that we have all been exploring here are so much also part of adult life and should be part of it. And what it seems to be about is it's a particular way of, so to say, acting and interacting with each other in an exploration of the world. And that's, I mean, this is not just kids that need to do this. We all need to do that. There is an exploration of possible worlds, and there is a construction of actual worlds that is involved in it on both parties, but inside of a particular framework. And I could be a little bit worried that the tendency would be to say, well, we need to protect the space for it in children or in preschool children, etc., but actually forget that this is something that's required for all of us and for society to actually be able to handle the kind of things that we are facing constantly as a society.
Can I add something?
Yeah.
And it's not just a human activity, it's all higher primates who play. I also think that calls a little bit to to a concern about that might be interesting in terms of what it's worth, that we have it in common with almost all, I mean, not just mammals, indeed also reptiles are found to be playing, of course not in the same ways. So I just really, I agree that we can't, it's the juice of life, you can't really sort of measure out exactly. And I also want to call for humility. I mean, very often in developmental science, we have come across or stumbled across connections between phenomena that we could have never sort of figured out rationally. So just because we can't measure a complete sort of one-to-one evidence-based effect of a certain activity or something, it doesn't mean that it doesn't have an effect. I mean, remember the breakthrough in children learning to read? You've had them read and read and read, and you find out they need to write as they read in order to become good readers. That wasn't a thought that would have just occurred to us. So we need to be humble in our expectations to what we can figure out in terms of these very, very complex interplay of all kinds of forces that sort of lead to developmental processes. That's just a cautious remark.
Yeah, you're quite agreeing. Just the last question before going to the audience is, Paul, you said in your presentation that some imagination or playful imagination was rather dull, rather simple, unsophisticated in a sense. So in a sense, I also thought, okay, maybe he's getting at how could we, as pedagogues, actually sophisticate play? Yes, it is a human activity. It can be sophisticated and non-sophisticated. So, in a sense, when you say let us not intervene, in a sense, you're also saying it's up to the children to be unsophisticated or sophisticated.
You're trying to get me to give advice, and I'm very reluctant. What I will say is I think children are tremendously good at plagiarism.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
And adults can take advantage of that if they think of it as enriching.
Okay. Very good. Let's go to the first question. You will get the microphone.
Okay, thank you. I'm trying to make a connection between the different presentations. And in your presentation, Paul, you said that children's play reflects reality. And then in your presentation, Ditte, I want to ask a question to your presentation, because you talk about the role adults can play after they see boys excluding the girls. But if children are learning from their reality, to what extent are adults involved in creating the social construct in the first place? Children didn't learn to exclude each other independent of adults. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Is it addressing you, Ditte?
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, of course, a game of soccer is gendered. I mean, female soccer players are not as famous and exposed as the male football in the adult, I mean, in our shared world. So it's not weird or particularly mean that the boys are reproducing this in their play worlds. And you're right. I mean, this could have been addressed in this particular childcare much more aggressively, that there was this gender discrimination was going on. They just didn't, in this particular childcare environment, take that critical stance towards it. So I'm not advocating that adults should let children develop their own cultural worlds and then come and correct it afterwards. But I'm just saying that it's not a direct replica either of the adult world and not either of their own real worlds. I mean, one of the boys' mother was in fact their coach coach in the local soccer club, so they do know that females can be experts in soccer. It was more about their own identity formation. And in that particular binary conception around 5-year-olds on gender, girls just couldn't be included. That's how I figure their motives for excluding girls.
Thank you. We have another question. Yeah.
Dag, Marie from Videnskab.dk. I actually have 2 questions. Is that okay?
That's okay.
The first one, Paul, you said in your presentation that this pretend play is sort of unique for the human race. But how is it different from, for example, a lion, a baby lion playing that it's hunting, or playing that the baby lions, maybe they play together, that they are fighting? Isn't it somewhat the same?
Well, it's certainly true that you see play fighting, for example, in lots of animals. But play fighting tends to, I mean, the play activities of the lion seem to be relatively restricted. So it's rather localized activities that get as it were, practiced, so to speak. Whereas with children, you see them incorporating cultural realities. I mean, the Cora example of the child with the Nespresso machine, in some sense, they are omnivorous, so they incorporate a great deal of cultural material into their play. So maybe I should retract a little bit and say we do see these pretend activities, although in the case of the lion, it's still not quite clear whether, in some sense, if they're growling at us or pouncing on a stick, whether the stick is seen as a piece of prey, or whether the stick has simply got the perceptual affordances which elicits the pouncing. So it's much more difficult to diagnose what's going on with non-human species. With the children, of course, you often are getting the running commentary. The child is elaborating on the pretend scenario with language, and so you can infer this rich imaginative activity.
And then the other one, it's just my son, he's almost 3 years old, and often when he really wants me to play with him, and then once in a while when I say, okay, then we go in and play with the cars, and then it always ends up me doing it wrong. If I really engage in the game and drive around with the cars, then he'll say, no, not like that, no, you're doing it wrong, and I just thought, why does that happen? Is it because he's just, or should I just let him control the game, or should I sort of fight him and say, no, I want to do it this way, because he also has to learn that he can't sort of be in control all the time? Or did I maybe cross some rules that I didn't know exist, or what happens?
He's very advanced on the scalar dimension.
But going back to the idea again that these things are actually something that needs to be learned as well. I mean, learning to play with others is not a trivial thing. To figuring out how do you, so to say, let the process develop, how do you not impose your agency on the people you want to play with, is not something that's easily done. And this is almost part of the play activity in itself, is figuring out how to do it. How not to be a Spielverderber, or someone who stops the play. And kids are really sensitive to this, that blocking the game is what you're not allowed to do, because that stops the process from having. But realizing what does it take not to stop the game is really difficult. And it might be that it's not just you who have to learn that. He might also really have to learn, well, what is it like to be interacting with another person who also has a sense of agency and has some sense of autonomy, and whom I cannot control, and how do we create the space in such a way that it can actually develop, right? So I think there's kind of a meta-commentary ongoing as you develop a play, which is how do you keep the play going? And what does it take to be able to develop that? And that might be kind of, if you want to think in terms of learning, a really critical element, because that is also what translates into all the other situations where you're facing other people in a non-rule bound-like environment. How do we make certain that there is a space for us to develop together?
Could I just add, it's a very informal comment. So when you were both speaking, I was thinking about my 3 sons and individual personality differences. So I'm thinking of occasions when we've tried to play Scrabble together, and the middle son is very keen on exactly following the rules to the point of being exasperating for his older and younger brother. And I was wondering, should I step back and think of this as a more mature perspective or a less mature perspective? Anyway, so I mean, more generally, the extent to which there's a individual differences component alongside a developmental component here. I think some of us are very comfortable with fluid activities, and some of us are much more comfortable with these relatively highly regulated activities.
I also have a middle son with that strategy, and and there might be a competitive element to it. You can't beat your older brother, but you can beat him by the rules. But you can outsmart your younger brother, and you're not allowed to beat him. So, for the middle son, insisting on the rules gives some space both up and down.
Okay. I'll think about that.
Okay. I think we touched upon a very important subject because, I mean, the importance of play is certainly there, and early education and care is today in Denmark called, and in most other countries called high politics. And we can also read in the newspaper that the university colleges are trying to learn the becoming pedagogues how to learn to be playful. And in that sense, maybe there will also be a course for parents, but it is quite important if this is something that we can actually learn, and if we learn it, we can actually engage as playful companions for children. Is that what you're actually saying, not as a parent, but also in relation to professionals, that there is a need for them to invest more in learning to be playful companions for children? Ditte?
Yes, I think it has been quite underestimated. I mean, if you call for new professionals in your childcare center, is it part of the portfolio you should be happy to and good in playing with children? Mm-hmm. Very often not. It's other kinds of competencies that are sought after, and definitely it's a skill. It's something that you learn through all social participation, and I think we shouldn't forget the mothers and fathers also in this. I mean, first play happens at home when you breastfeed your child. So this is very fundamental, rudimentary social processes from the onset, and that takes on throughout development. So you can practice being playful, but I think some of the same rules apply also to adult play with children. It has to be voluntary to be good. It has to be, in the mode or mood of playfulness. If you're forced to play as part of the curriculum and you don't feel like it won't be good. And if you for some reason find it very difficult to enter these playful modes and exploratory and pretend scenarios, you might be the one setting the table to let a colleague do the play work, because it has to be for real. You can't force it.
I think it's a really good question. In anthropology, you have this classical tension between do you observe or do you participate? You have this tension between do you observe or do you participate? And that could be one way to think of your role as an adult, right? Either you observe the play or you participate in it. But it seems to me that none of those metaphors are really apt for this situation. It might be much more a matter of what you might call to curate or to shepherd or to grow or to facilitate. not so much design, because I don't think it's a designing and stepping away and let it happen, but being able to, so to say, be attentive to what it takes for the process to develop. And I think this is a very different role from how we have usually thought about being a playful adult, where in a sense you have to be in there to do it. I mean, there is so much of this that is about, so to say, equals figuring it out together. And that's a critical part of it. And being an adult in the middle of that, do all sorts of things to that dynamic. But figuring out what does it actually take, not just to design the possibility for it to happen, but also as things develop, to be curating and shepherding and, so to say, allowing that to grow along the many potential dimensions. I think that would be really interesting to explore more what that would be.
So I would just add one quick comment, which is that, of course, when we're doing that, we're making a rather culturally specific choice. Yeah. The idea that adults should curate children's play is not found in many cultures of the world. I mean, I'm not saying it's wrong to do it, I'm just saying it's a cultural choice.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much. I think we will end the debate here with the choice of curating children's play. This is our choice. And maybe the choice also implicates that we could make a dancing early education sector in Denmark with facilitating pedagogues. Not so bad, if that's the case. At least for now, we will think about it, and we will go for lunch. But before going for lunch, we should thank the panel and give them an applause.